Welcome to another episode of the Rhyme and Reason podcast, brought to you by the College of Arts and Humanities, which we call ARHU at the University of Maryland. The Rhyme and Reason podcast is a series of riveting, provocative, fascinating discussions with some of our most compelling leaders in arts and humanities from the University of Maryland. Be sure to subscribe to the Rhyme and Reason podcast wherever you listen to your podcasts so you won't miss a single episode. I'm your host for the podcast, Stephanie Shonekan. I'm the proud dean of the College of Arts and Humanities. Over the next few weeks, we're providing a series of race, equity, and justice conversations right here on the Rhyme and Reason podcast. We'll hear from folks across the ARHU spectrum who are studying and thinking about these powerful ideas. It's a great honor to welcome to the Rhyme and Reason podcast Jeffrey Herf, a distinguished University Professor Emeritus from ARHU's Department of History. Thanks so much for being here, Jeffrey.
Thank you very much for having me.
Of course. So let me tell you a little bit more about Jeffrey Herf. Jeffrey Herf studies the intersection of ideas and politics in modern European history, specializing in 20th century Germany. He has published extensively, and let me just underscore that, extensively, on Germany during the Weimar Republic, Nazi Germany, the Holocaust, and on West and East Germany during the Cold War. His research interests now focused on the Nazi period and German and European history in post-World War II decades up to the collapse of communism and the end of the Cold War in 1989. For his extensive, prolific, and influential scholarship, Professor Herf received the university's highest honor when he was named a distinguished university professor in 2014. So let me start, Jeffrey, with asking you how you came to this research area. Where did you go to college? And let's just hear the journey up to this point, and then we'll dive into some of the works.
Well, let's begin with biography and then childhood and quickly
please.
turn to college.
Mm-hmm.
My father left Germany in 1937.
Mm.
He did not regard himself as a Holocaust survivor. He always regarded himself as a very lucky guy. But the history of Nazism was very much on his mind, and so in our home that was a topic of discussion. My parents divorced when I was 6. My mother came from a family of Ukrainian Jews who had settled in Milwaukee. East European Jews, so the German Jews and the East European Jews were of a very different mode, and so I was very conscious of being Jewish, and then when I went to University of Wisconsin, I had some professors who were themselves historians of Nazism, and that's where the interest began. I was in the 1960s. I was in SDS and was a young leftist, and the questions about Israel and anti-Semitism were not very much on my mind. But then, as I rethought issues about the radical left in the 70s, and I returned to concern with these issues. And we like to think that it doesn't make any difference who you are, but it does make a difference who you are.
Right.
Well, there's no point in being naive about that.
Right.
And so the fact that I wrote Reactionary Modernism or The Jewish Enemy or Nazi Propaganda for the Arab World, of course it has something to do with the fact of who I am and where I come from.
That's so compelling, and I can relate so well to the idea of how who we are informs what we find important to do scholarship on. And so I would love to jump into talking about some of your works, Jeffrey. And I want to start not with your first one, but I want to start with The Jewish Enemy, which you published in 2006.
Yes.
And you the book was reviewed in American Historical Association, of course, one of the main periodicals for the field. And this is what the reviewer said, quote, Herf has written a thoughtful and provocative account of aspects of the propaganda that constructed a mythical Jewish enemy that threatened Germans in their homeland and legitimized war and ultimately genocide. As such, it offers a timely reminder of the unfettered paranoid ideology that underpinned the Third Reich. So, I mean, it's a wonderful review and an overview of what that book is about. Can you tell us what that book is about and what lessons we can pull from the Jewish enemy?
Let me backtrack a bit to biography. I was in SDS, and I was in SDS in 1968, 69.
Tell us what SDS is.
Students for Democratic Society. It was the main new leftist organization. And by 1969 and 70, there was a lot of ideological fanaticism in SDS, and I saw it up close, and I moved away from it. But from that experience, I thought that it was utterly realistic, not naive, to understand that in politics, ideological commitments can have an enormous causal importance. So then when I studied the Nazis, what they said in public was so ridiculous, so absurd, so contrary to common sense and fact that there was a tendency in the social sciences to say they can't really mean that. There must be a tool used for other purposes. And I said, no, actually, they did mean it. And when I began to work on the Jewish enemy, I read Hitler again, I read Goebbels, and I said, this is much more interesting than I anticipated. And even though there's a flood of work on the Nazi regime, people haven't read these very famous texts as carefully as I thought they should. The Nazis created a world in which an innocent Germany was being assaulted on all sides by an all-powerful and genocidal Jewry. And the response was an act of massive self-defense called the Holocaust. So that was an original contribution.
That's great.
Yeah.
That's great.
I mean, the E.H. Gombrich worked for the BBC during World War II, and he got it. He wrote he gave a fine lecture in 1969 or 70 about the paranoid construct, and I elaborated on that. So the one lesson that this historian drew is that some of the most important historical documents are not in archives, but they're the very public statements that people don't take seriously enough.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Oof. And yeah, that's giving me chills because we think about this notion of paranoia and public statements. And I know as scholars we tend to go to the archives, but what you've just said is really important, especially for our scholars, our students right now.
Yes, well, when politicians say the kind of things that Hitler said in public, and he said very, very blunt and truthful things in public about what he intended to do, it's important to take them very seriously. And that is so a leitmotif of my scholarship is the intersection of intellectual history and political history. And the Jewish enemy is an example of that. It's both intellectual history and political history at the same time. And sometimes people who are trained in the social sciences or who view ideas as tools and instruments think, well, yeah, anti-Semitism was a tool, as an instrument to befuddle the masses, or the Jews are a scapegoat and the system needs a scapegoat, so you're not going to kill the scapegoat. But something can be an instrument and a tool at the same time that it is also a deeply held conviction. And that is and that's an argument that the book, The Jewish Enemy, makes at some length.
All right, now let's jump now to another book I'd like to talk about, which is Israel's Moment.
Yeah.
And Israel's Moment was published in 2022, I believe, and also, of course, got rave reviews because from the moment you started writing to now, you've had lots of experience learning how to build your argument, but also basing it on facts and historical data. Correct?
Yes, yes. The Israel's Moment is a book mostly about the United States and the United Nations. And one of the great advantages of being a historian at the University of Maryland, College Park, is that the archives of the United States are a mile from where we're sitting.
That's right.
So there's no plane fare, no train fare, no hotels, no eating in restaurants.
You can take an Uber.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. So we're right here, and it is a gold mine. So the book draws heavily on State Department files, on intelligence files.
That's wonderful, wonderful. The review from the Wall Street Journal for Israel's Moment reads, quote, Jeffrey Herf is the author of several esteemed works of modern German history, and he presents a vivid portrait of this dramatic period and a trenchant analysis of the forces at work. Along the way, he reminds us of how contentious the debate was within the UN itself and within the most powerful governments of the time. And of course, here he's referring to the creation of Israel.
This is the first book. This is my first book that is not about German history. And that immediate post-war period of that shift from the anti-Hitler, anti-Nazi coalition to the Cold War has interested me. You know, it's a fascinating period. And it's in those years that the state of Israel was the debate about the state of Israel took place. But if we focus on the State Department files, what is striking is the degree of opposition to the establishment of the state of Israel in the American national security establishment, especially because people make the case Israel is a form of colonialism or imperialism or what have you. But the quote colonialists and imperialists, if you want to use those terms, of 1945, 6, 7 in the State Department and the Pentagon thought the establishment of a Jewish state in Palestine was a terrible idea. President Truman famously supported it, but his Secretary of State was George Marshall, formerly General George Marshall, next to President Truman, the most famous public figure in the United States. He couldn't very well fire George Marshall because they both agreed on more important things. And the more important things were the containment of communism and rebuilding Western Europe and the beginnings of the Cold War. And Israel was a bit of a sideshow. But when push came to shove in 1947-48, what the Zionists in pre-state Palestine needed were weapons, guns. And the United States didn't send them, imposed an embargo instead. And the weapons instead came from communist Czechoslovakia.
I appreciate how you framed the purpose of this book, which you've set out in 4 pillars, and the fourth I want to read that to back to you. It says the fourth reason that this book is important or must be read is the passions of 2 eras: World War II and the Holocaust, and the Cold War. One just passed, and another just beginning, shaped Israel's movement. So I really appreciate that notion of looking at these 2 eras. But I think we're in a 3rd era now. I mean, the attention to the formation of Israel, its foundations. I think this book is almost required reading for us so that we can understand what's going on right now.
Well, I hope so. I think in 1945, 6, 7, 8, 9, if you were a young liberal or a left liberal or even a leftist, the chances are that you would view the establishment of the State of Israel as a continuation of the anti-fascist, anti-Nazi sentiments of the Second World War. And because the Zionists were fighting against British colonialism, and because there were Arabs who fought with the Allies against the Nazis. There were, but the leaders of the opposition to the establishment of the State of Israel in Palestine were also infamous for their collaboration with the Nazis. And this is not an exaggeration. This is very famous at the time. It's not. Hajj al-Husseini was on the radio. Hajj al-Husseini was the leader of the ARHU Committee, and made the decision to oppose the partition resolution. It's an enormous tragedy because if the Palestine Arabs had accepted the UN resolution, there would have been a Palestinian state since 1948 or 47. And I think the realities of those years get lost as a result of what I view as a distorted history of the establishment of the State of Israel that has, I think, unfortunately, found an echo in the universities. So,
and I suppose that echo is sort of amplified by folks who would like to look at the creation of the State of Israel with a much wider lens. And so, what do you say to that?
Well, the bottom line is, I would say that the historians have a slogan: "The past is a foreign country," but sometimes the present is a foreign country too. And to understand what went on in the 1940s and since, it's important not to see it as a projection of American politics. And that is what I think has gone on in the universities, that people project questions about white and black, oppression and liberation, from the American experience onto what's going on there. And that, I think, is fundamentally mistaken. The Palestine Liberation Organization in the 1960s and 70s and 80s made the case that the establishment of the State of Israel was unjust and an example of racism and colonialism, and that the Palestinian struggle was part of a third world revolt against Western imperialism, and that Zionism was a form of imperialism. But the Zionists there was no metropole. There were no resources in Palestine to exploit, no oil or minerals. The people coming were not looking for riches. They were desperate refugees. So the colonial analogy, I think, is mistaken. And that is a controversial view, and I think a minority view in the humanities. And let me say one other aspect about the humanities. One of the purposes of the interpretive cultural sciences is to grasp how others see the world. And if you're being a historian of Nazism, of course, it means grasping how Hitler saw the world or Goebbels saw the world.
Exactly.
You wind up, into the gutter. You're in the midst of rubbish. But that's how they saw the world. And what Hitler and Goebbels had in common with me was that they're human beings, right? The task of the humanities it was, in those days, to take them seriously. And there were a minority of people who took them seriously. But it was the same thing was true of the Islamists. And the Islamists were very clear about what they meant, that they interpreted the religion of Islam, which is one thing. The religion of Islam is one thing, and Islamism is another, right? And the Islamists were very clear that they hated the Jews. And because they hated Judaism and the Jews, and therefore they wanted to destroy the State of Israel. They said so over and over again publicly. They were very proud of it. And people said, no, they don't really mean it. And Israel is on the West Bank, and the settlers are doing this, and all that. But they meant it. One of the strangest developments of recent years is that the center of antagonism to Israel in the American universities, not only in Maryland, but around the United States, is in the humanities. So from my point of view, there's been a big failure in the humanities, a huge failure of understanding and interpretation.
I hear you, Jeffrey. I think I want to go back to something you said much earlier, which is that as scholars, we focus on what we know, what we've grown up with, what our worldview is, and is there an understanding of the humanists who have a different read of the state of Israel that has to do with their understanding of what settler realities have been in different parts of the world?
Of course, I'm for pluralism. Of
Yes.
course, I'm for a multiplicity of perspectives and
Yes.
for debate and discussion, absolutely.
Yes.
But but I'm not alone in worrying that we are now in a new era for Jews in American academic life, and that one is assumed guilty until proven otherwise of being a supporter of the Zionist project. So Israel's Moment is an attempt to get people who will be willing to read it to take this term Zionism and Zionist that became toxic in terms of abuse, and to see it rather differently.
So that brings us to, I'd love to talk very quickly about your latest book, Three Faces of Antisemitism. And I wanted to come to that book because of what we're going through as a nation. So tell us what's sort of the overarching argument in Three Faces of Antisemitism.
It's a defense of the liberal center. That's basically what it is. Okay, I have a very well-established reputation for writing about Nazi anti-Semitism. So, and I in 2016, I wrote an essay, "Is Donald Trump a Fascist?" which was about his authoritarian inclinations. I've written about anti-Semitism in the communist world, and then I've written about the Islamists. So in this very polarized intellectual and political world, Three Faces of Anti-Semitism is an attempt to strike out my anchor in the center, in the tradition of liberalism. One of the things that I feel very strongly is that it's been very unfortunate that the presence of anti-Semitism from the Islamist tradition has not been examined more deeply than it should be. And sometimes the people who work on the Middle East and work on these issues in American universities have been, in my view, derelict in not raising the warning, not addressing these issues. The concept of Islamophobia became utilized to prevent examination. So if people read the Hamas Charter of 1988, it is a profoundly reactionary document. It has nothing to do with traditions of liberalism or the left. And yet, somehow Hamas escaped from severe criticism. So Three Faces of Anti-Semitism is an attempt to stake out that middle ground.
So very complex topic, anti-Semitism, and I see you dismantling this tendency to put anti-Semitism and Islamophobia on the same platform.
Right.
And I wanted to ask you something about that because here at the University of Maryland, we have a task force, on anti-Semitism and Islamophobia. And Islamophobia is real. I was in this country when 9/11 happened, and sort of the bubbling up of Islamophobia was something that I saw very, very clearly. So can you talk a little bit about what your advice to a university might be in thinking about these two very real problems?
My advice, this sounds like a slogan, but no double standards. Right? No double standards. So my colleagues in German history, I think there's a consensus among them who would say, without the arguments that Christianity made for 2,000 years, there wouldn't have been a Holocaust. But Christianity did not lead inevitably to the Holocaust. It was a radicalization of very old hatreds. So if we talk, and many of us do, about the radicalization of Christianity, then it is perfectly appropriate to talk about the radicalization of Islam and the interpretation of Islam that emerged in the 20th century in Egypt and the Muslim Brothers, then later in Iran, which is misogynist, anti-Jewish, just culturally reactionary and terroristic. And it is an attack on the West. Some of the sharpest and best critics of the Islamists are in Morocco, or refugees who've left Syria, who have seen it up close, or the young women in Iran. And those voices should have a space in American universities. When you spent your scholarly career working on what I've worked on, it does strain your belief in God. I'll be perfectly frank. So I have no idea if God is there or not, but I do know the great deal of harm has been done over time by people who do have these beliefs. So that's the slogan: no double standards.
Again, I'm really glad that you made a distinction between Islam and Islam, right? That because I grew up in a country which was almost half Christian, half Muslim. My husband's family has folks who are Muslim, and he's Christian, and everybody got along.
Yeah.
Until, I would say, late 90s, early 2000s with Boko Haram and so on. A very different face of Islam. What we need to get to is a place where the faculty who work on Palestine are not called anti-Jew, right? And where we get to and that same point where we can pick up a book by Jeffrey Herf and know that he's not Islamophobic, right? Like where do we go to get to a place, or how can we get to a place where we can sort of open up our minds and not label people before we study them?
The best way in which this conversation can continue or take place at the University of Maryland is for people to pay attention to what other people have done. Nothing is more gratifying to a scholar than having somebody actually pay attention to what you've done. The really talented people are most interested in the work. And they know what it means to try to answer a difficult question by looking at evidence. And looking at evidence that supports your view and doesn't support your view. And so if you have that conversation among the people who are serious scholars, that's one way in which the intellectual community of the university can survive.
So, thank you, Jeffrey, for joining me today on Rhyme and Reason. Clearly, we could have talked all day.
Yeah. It's been a pleasure. I really have enjoyed this a great deal.
Excellent.
And these are very, very difficult times for the universities and for the humanities. And I just wish there were more administrators and deans like you.
I'm proud to say that there are a number. There are a number. So listeners, I hope you enjoyed this discussion of some of the most important questions concerning justice and history and the future. Please join us again on Rhyme and Reason for our next episode. In ARHU, we're boldly human and fearlessly creative in our classes, in our research, and in our community engagement. Be sure to visit www.arhu.umd.edu to learn more about the College of Arts and Humanities at the University of Maryland. Thanks for listening.